Hi everyone, welcome back to our ISP speaker series. It's a pleasure to be here again. So for today, we are really pleased to have Ignacio Cofone. He's a professor of law and regulation of AI at the University of Oxford, in particular at the Faculty of Law and also at the Institute for Ethics in AI. His research is mainly focused on how the law can and should adapt to social and economic changes driven by data and AI. His recent book is called The Privacy Policy. I really encourage you reading it if you are interested in privacy. And please join me in welcoming our speaker for today.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming here. I wanted to tell you about why and also how AI requires changing privacy law. And I prepared a short talk to get us started, but please feel free to ask me anything you'd like. I'm happy to discuss anything that you're interested in. So the talk is mostly about the information economy. What is the information economy? The information economy is the system in which companies make money, not only from the money that we give them, but also from the data that we give them. And that includes companies that we don't usually give money to, like Facebook, or Meta, who owns Facebook, or Alphabet that owns Google, but also involves companies that we do give money to, like with Netflix, to whom we give money and data. Amazon, where if you subscribe to Amazon Prime, you give the money and data, and they make money out of both. Now, why is this relevant? Because AI has changed the harms in the information economy in ways that privacy law is not very well adjusted to. When we think of AI harms in the information economy, we're used to thinking about situations of one victim and one perpetrator. Think, for example, about deepfakes. Deepfakes are videos or images constructed to resemble someone based on many pictures or many videos of that someone that are often used to harm people. For example, when they're used for non-consensual pornography fabrication. We are used to thinking about deepfakes as cases of one bad apple doing harm to one particular person. But when we do that, we obscure the system that exists behind it that enables that creation, also amplifies that creation. Deepfakes are produced with AI products that are given to people, often for profit. They're often hosted in websites that derive profit out of advertisement. Sometimes they're shared on Twitter that also makes revenue out of content being shared there. And some of these harms of the information economy have this characteristic of having one very visible victim that had all the harm concentrated in them. But many others are opaque and dispersed, which doesn't make them less real. Cambridge Analytica is a recent, very notable example of eventual harm that was highly dispersed, but was real nonetheless. Other very real harms of crossing people's personal information are AI systems used by the police that have disparate error rates, for example, where people of minorities are subjected to higher false arrests than people from majority groups. The upshot is that whether it's visible harms like harms of non-consensual pornography or more opaque harms like the harms of Cambridge Analytica or harms of discrimination, all of the people who suffered those harms did so because they were pulled into the information economy, because they live in a society where having our data processed is simply part of our daily interactions. And because doing so is part of our daily interactions, we are all part of the information economy, whether we like it or not, and whether we know it or not. If you want a fun, although possibly devastating experiment, you can go and get one of the many facial recognition apps that sells to any member of the public. I put my picture through one called Prim Eyes. If you get an account in this or another facial recognition software, some of them like Clearview don't sell to individuals, other ones do sell to individuals, which is great for stalkers. You can put your picture and you will see any picture online that resembles your face based on facial recognition. And when I put mine, I thought, what can I possibly see? I'm a boring law professor. There'll be pictures of me paying attention in conferences and nothing more. And also there will be lots of false positives because my face is relatively generic. I saw dozens of pictures with no false positives that include clubs 20 years ago where I did not know there was a photographer. A day where I was officiating the wedding of a data protection lawyer. Pictures where, if you see the full-blown picture, my face was 3 pixels in the background, but blown up, the software can identify the face. I'm sure that's the case for most of you too, because these softwares got really good. And the point is, even in situations where you think no one is paying attention, where you think that you are not engaging with the world through your data, because you're in a physical space where you don't know there's a photographer, where you don't know that it's being filmed, where you don't know that it's being uploaded, the information economy is always paying attention. And this matters because AI changed how the information economy works, and it changed it in 3 particular ways. Privacy law was designed with a system of consumer interactions in mind. The bare bones of privacy law was designed in what are called the Fair Information Practice Principles from the 80s, then turned into a data protection directive in the EU in the 90s and lots of statutes. And we kept that scheme of protecting people under the model of how they became as consumers. The paradigmatic case of privacy law when it was designed was that I may want to buy this computer, for example. So I could go to the Mac store and say, I would like this computer, please. And the person would say, okay, give me money for the computer. And I would say, here's some money for the computer. And then they may ask me, do you want to give us your email address where you could potentially get discounts for the store later on, or you may get a discount right now, or you may get a 2-for-1 if you give us your email address and agree to some sort of marketing emails. And privacy law was about giving me the power to say yes or no. But data interactions today are drastically different from that for 3 reasons. The first of those reasons is inferences. There are always inferences about people. Companies try to estimate who would spend a lot of money or who would spend very little money based on the behavior they had. Companies try to estimate who's likely to like what product or not. But the proportion of information that is relevant and that is risky shifted, in which back in the day we have very few inferences, a lot of very relevant disclosed information such as our email addresses and our names. But right now, almost the only thing that matters is inferences. Car riding apps can determine how much you're willing to pay for a car based on the battery levels of your phone, how many people are calling cars around you, and how often you clicked one type of car versus another type of car in the past. Streaming platforms that show you music can infer your ethnicity based on the type of music that you share. Companies can infer your sexuality with a relatively level of accuracy based on the metadata of how you text. And these are just some of the things that we know, and just from one data point or another. But the possibilities to infer things about you based on a combination of data points is endless and is impossible to anticipate. Every mini decision that we make in the information economy about whether to like something, whether to share something, whether to agree with a privacy policy, is only a decision about a little piece of an enormous puzzle about our digital identity that gets formed in the background and that we never know about and it is impossible to anticipate. That breaks down the model of we give people choices so people can self-protect, and they will agree to data practices that are safe and will not agree to data practices that are not safe, because it is simply impossible for anyone to know what disclosure would lead to an inference that is safe or that is unsafe. Sometimes not even the companies know it. The second reason for which data practices are different is that data is relational. Privacy law is obsessed with thinking that data belongs to one person, or the data is about one person. And you may have heard a lot about data ownership, the idea that the solution to privacy is to give people ownership over their personal data. But the reality is that very few data is about one person. Even before AI, I could turn around right now and take a selfie of all of us. There are 2 ways to regulate that selfie. Either you need the consent of every person in this room to upload it, therefore no one has control of their personal information. Or anyone in this room can choose unilaterally to upload it because the picture is about them. Therefore, no one has control of their personal information. And that simple dissonance that was always true for meaningless pieces of information like selfies is true for a very meaningful piece of information today. If I were to download TikTok right now, which I have never downloaded, it will take the app about 2-3 minutes based on my swiping patterns to figure out my approximate age, possibly sexuality, possibly ethnicity, possibly income bracket, and the location will know right away the moment that I download it. As soon as it has those basic demographics about me, the app will also have a host of information about me because it has a host of probabilistic information about each group. Valuable and risky data is not only data about individuals, it's also data about groups that are about patterns and trends that companies do have and can match with whomever they get a bit of information from. And the third difference is power. Who here has heard of Compass? About half of you. So Compass is software used in many parts of the United States to determine whether someone going through the criminal justice process is high risk or low risk of committing a crime if released on parole or bail. And judges in some states of the United States use those risk scores to help determine whether that person should or should not be released on parole or bail. Now, Compass is a significant bias problem that has been reported by the media on several occasions, but there's a larger issue to cases like Compass. Maybe people in this room did not or may not go to the criminal justice system, or maybe they did or would, but everyone here has a credit score. Everyone here has their likelihood to get loans, car rentals, apartment rentals determined through their personal information, not because they chose to, but that's just because the system is designed in that way. The discretion of thousands of bank tellers back in the day, where one person would determine whether someone else gets a loan, gets replaced by the discretion of a few designers that design an algorithm that calculates everyone's credit scores in a way that concentrates power. Similarly, when you apply for a job, you may or may not be applying to a company that chooses to use AI to screen CVs before they get sent to HR. There's no choice about whether your CV is screened or not. And even if there is a choice about your CV not being screened, exercising that choice would mean depriving yourself of a job opportunity. The point is, the system is designed with the idea that we make choices over our data, but oftentimes our data makes choices about us, which is quite the opposite. And that also breaks down the way that we think about information. So what do I do about this? You probably heard a lot about accountability. You may have heard that there's a mantra in Silicon Valley that says that companies need to move fast and break things to remain disruptive and to remain innovative. And some people support that mantra and some people decry it as a sign that many companies don't care about people's well-being. And it's good to think about accountability, but since the Fair Information Practice Principles, we've been thinking about accountability the wrong way, because we've been thinking about accountability as compliance in a way that many scholars in privacy law call box-ticking compliance. People are concerned about whether compliance with specific laws and regulations constitutes any meaningful type of accountability, because the reality is that that compliance leaves lots of harms out. Many of the scandals that we see where people have been actively harmed, people have been actively harmed in compliance with privacy law or with data protection law. And the reason is that in the same way that when people agree or don't agree to a data collection, they cannot anticipate every harm that can happen because of that data collection. Legislators, even excellent legislators that are not subjected to lobby, cannot predict every single harmful data practice and prohibit it in advance. So compliance with whatever companies promise people that they will or will not do, plus with whatever legislators anticipated will be harmful, is insufficient and leaves lots of harms out because it extends the basic prediction problem that the consumer model had in the first place. Most harms in the information economy do not happen because of one flatly unfair data practice that's always harmful and always unfair, but rather they happen because one particular type of data practice can be used in a harmful way or not. For example, many apps will ask you to agree to third-party data sharing. there's one queer dating app that got sanctioned by the Norwegian Data Protection Authority recently because it turns out that after people said that they agreed to third-party data sharing, allegedly the company had been sharing since 2017 its user base to undisclosed third parties, essentially telling undisclosed third parties who is gay and potentially subjecting them to violence. Third-party data sharing can be something as harmless as I don't have servers large enough to deal with my data, so I need to send this data to external servers that have high cybersecurity standards and keep the data safe. Or it can be something as harmful as exploiting their user base, monetizing their identity for further profit, besides advertisement profit, based on what third parties will pay for that. So privacy loss challenge is no longer this regulation of individual choices, as we often assume it to be. Privacy loss challenge is about regulating power to unilaterally create harm and how to govern that power to unilaterally create harm versus people's data. And regulating power is not about presenting choices to the powerless. It's about creating responsibility mechanisms for the consequences of what companies do. So how do we do this? Well, to address the systemic effects of relationships of power, we need a notion of data-based exploitation. And we can ground that notion of data-based exploitation on the idea of privacy. So we can start identifying privacy violation practices by connecting these practices, not so much on whatever a company promised, because they can promise very little, or whatever a legislator anticipated is always harmful, because that can also be very little, but rather for what kind of activities violate the social value that privacy is. And there are two reasons for which I think we need to do this. One is because of evidence or proof. If any of you are unlucky enough to ever be subjected to identity theft, you will probably find out that it's almost impossible to find anyone who's responsible for the identity theft. Because the reality is that most people that are victim to identity theft are not so because a hacker found one database with all the information about that person and got all that information that the person gave as a package to that single entity, and that entity's low cybersecurity standard are single-handedly responsible for the identity theft plus the hacker. The reality is that most situations of harms like identity theft happen because of information aggregation, because of information that gets pulled from all sorts of different sources. And in terms of causation and in terms of evidence, it is almost impossible to find who ends up being responsible for that. So not creating accountability for exposing people to those harms also means not creating accountability for those harms themselves. Because after they happen, years later, the responsibility is dispersed, it's really difficult to prove, and it's really difficult to find the cause. So we have lots of material expositions to harm with no consequence. But the second reason for which this type of accountability is important is because of what I call the privacy fallacy. Privacy fallacy is the contradiction that many people engage in when they say that privacy is very valuable. Privacy is a social value that we all ought to protect. But when we think about privacy harms, we only think about the material consequences of data practices, like identity theft, like discrimination, like harms to democracy, but not the harm of privacy in itself. And saying that privacy is social value implies, by extension, saying that there is such a thing that can be harmed as privacy. Imagine that you have a trans coworker, and that coworker gets outed by a colleague just for fun, just because they thought it was a good idea. And then your trans coworker gets fired because it happens that your employer is also a bigot. Most of us would agree that that person suffered two types of harms. One was the harm of being outed, which interfered with their autonomy, with their ability to decide who knows what and in what circumstance, and where someone exploited their identity for fun. And the second one was the harm of being fired, which could be financial. And if that person sued under anti-discrimination law and got rehired, which would be difficult in the current context, but imagine that it is possible and that person does get rehired after suing for anti-discrimination law, most of us would think that the second harm got remedied but not the first. And the harm of being outed was still real. and was left unaddressed by the rehiring of that person. That clear distinction that we do see for harms across individuals, we lose when we think about the information economy oftentimes. A couple of years ago, the credit rating agency TransUnion got sued in a class action because they incorrectly inferred, according to the case, that about 2,000 people were terrorists. And when a credit rating agency makes an inference that someone's a terrorist, they get quite a different treatment than when it doesn't. So for about 600 of those people, where the information was shared to third parties, those people did not get, for example, a car that they had applied to for a loan, an apartment that they had asked to rent, a loan at the bank, and some of them potentially employment, because when employers pulled their credit record, then that information popped up. When they sued at the Supreme Court, they lost because in a ruling written by Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court said, these people have nothing in common. I cannot certify them as a class. Some people didn't get a car, some people didn't get an apartment, some people potentially didn't get a job. All of those are really difficult to prove. There's nothing that joins them together to certify this class action. That is the problem of the privacy fallacy. It's saying like, oh yeah, there is a social value that is called privacy that is legally protected in the United States, but once something happens, we don't see incorrectly inferring that someone is a terrorist with the same data practice as a separate type of harm that binds them in the same way that the trans person was harmed independently of their being fired. So the second reason for which this type of accountability is important is, besides the fact that material harm goes unrecognized if we don't, immaterial harm goes unrecognized too. And now, you probably hear a lot of people saying that they don't care about their privacy, and saying, oh, I don't care about their privacy because I have nothing to hide, or I don't care about their privacy because I'm happy to share information to get a certain type of product. And that's fair. Secrecy is not always socially or privately beneficial. Information control is not always socially or privately beneficial. If we think about privacy as secrecy or about controlling our personal information, there are genuine reasons to believe that we oftentimes shouldn't care about their privacy. But I can bet that everyone in this room, and also everyone outside of this room, cares about not being exploited. Now, there are different ways to get there. There are different ways to think about how do we create accountability for exploitation. I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A if you're interested, but I want to discuss three quick upsides before wrapping up. The first upside of thinking about regulating the information economy, including the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information, as preventing exploitation, is that it overcomes the problems of the consumer model. It overcomes putting all the weight on the shoulders of every individual person that cannot anticipate inferences, that whose information also informs others, and that has decisions made about them rather than the other way around. The second upside is that it overcomes the problems of accountability that current regulations have faced so far. It doesn't expect legislators and regulators to be able to anticipate every single harmful use and list them, and then avoids responsibility for every use that was not enumerated. And the third upside is that it overcomes the trope that you probably heard many times, and you hear in the last month or two more than ever, about regulation versus innovation. And the idea that we should not regulate AI, because if we regulate AI, we will stop AI innovation. And if we stop AI innovation, our enemies, other countries, will not regulate AI, and they will win the AI race. Well, there's one obvious problem and one less obvious problem with that. The more obvious problem is that that depends on what you mean by innovation. And some types of innovation may be desirable, and some other types of innovation may not be necessarily desirable if we define innovation as literally anything new. But the more nuanced problem is that there are different types of regulation in the relationship to innovation. Some types of regulation actually stop innovation. If we pass a rule that says that facial recognition from now on is prohibited, that will stop innovations regarding facial recognition. Other types of regulation actually enable innovation. Intellectual property law is an entire body of law that is a form of regulation that is meant to encourage innovation. Property rights do the same. Contract law does the same. There are endless elements of the law that are regulation that enable innovation. And the third type of regulation reroutes innovation from one type to the other. When the automobile industry started being regulated quite a few decades ago, and we did things like mandated seatbelts and airbags, sectors of the automobile industry were very concerned. And they said, oh, how can you mandate seatbelts and airbags? What you're doing is you're halting the innovation of the automobile industry by increasing your costs. Do you notice what you're doing? This is terrible. Other countries will win the automobile industry race. What happened when we regulated that is that we shifted innovation from cars without seatbelts and airbags to cars with seatbelts and airbags. And accountability for non-exploitation is that type of regulation. It's the third type. It's one that will actually prevent some forms of innovation through liability, but will enable others. And if there is a type of invention that causes more harm in terms of exploitation and material harm than the benefit that it causes, so that a company that profits from it cannot pay out liability because it would have to pay out more than it actually gained, maybe that is a type of innovation that is not socially valuable and we should not have. Maybe we do want to win the AI race, but not having people in the country as collateral damage. So to wrap up, if you leave this talk with anything, because I'm almost at half an hour, I hope it is that we live in a very different reality than the one privacy law was built for. We moved away from that reality slowly but surely, and AI accelerated that move away from that reality. And in the world that we live now, where data is the lifeblood of the economy, figuring out how to protect people from data harms is key. So thank you for paying attention to this, Sam, and I'm happy to chat about anything that you'd like.
Yeah. Thanks for a great talk. So I'm just really curious about what is the current developments in how to remove personal data from large language models. Like,
oh yeah,
is it technically or I don't know, legally? There's some question that it's always like like proposed, but I don't know what's technically is possible, or is there any work to make it happen?
Yeah, so I may not be the best person to ask that because I don't do technical work in computer science. However, I was speaking about this exact thing last week with an incoming computer science professor at Yale that maybe you should speak with, called Alexander Frederick Cooper, who does work on this. And what he explained to me is that it's actually way more complicated than we sometimes think. That there's a whole body of literature called machine and learning in computer science. And that body of literature is about how do we take out pieces of data from machine learning models, from large language models. But large language models don't work according to what has been explained to me, and I didn't check the math, but I believe him, don't work so linearly. So it could be that you end up taking out a piece of information, and that piece of information may still be there in the output in one way or the other, in ways that is not so clean to take out. And that, I mean, at least intuitively, that fits what we know about other types of AI. At the very beginning, when we start having very simple regression AI models for decision making, and then we found out that many of these models end up replicating and sometimes amplifying racial biases. The first thing that people thought about was, well, maybe we should remove race from the database, because that's what we do with humans, right? With humans, when we don't want someone to make a discriminatory decision, when we think that they want to make a discriminatory decision, we sometimes blind the decision maker. In some countries, CVs for jobs are submitted with initials, so it's hard to guess the person's gender. Sometimes we don't allow employers to ask specific questions about disability, so that they cannot, even whether they're trying to or because they're biased, make decisions that are influenced by that. So the intuition was that the same could happen at the very beginning of AI models, but that simply doesn't work because machine learning models pick up all sorts of things that correlate with race. So we're actually better off actually considering the information of race and applying methods from another body of literature called fairness adjustments, and then we can reduce the bias in the machine learning process. So intuitively, I would say that that's an extension of what happens with machine learning that, according to what people have explained to me, sounds like a good idea in theory, but it's actually quite difficult to implement.
Thank you. This is super interesting. So I have two questions. The first one has to do with the
practical implications of your new theory, right? This idea of understanding privacy as the prevention of exploitation. How do you translate that in terms of new tools? If we are leaving aside the FIPPs, what comes next? I know in your book you talk about torts and how to update it, so if you could tell us a little bit about that.
So,
Okay, go ahead.
No, tell me the second one.
No, go ahead, and based on that.
Okay, sounds good. I think we could get a lot out of one simple provision in most privacy statutes, or at least the comprehensive ones, that says if you benefit from a practice that exposes people to risk or harms their autonomy or intimacy, then you're liable for that practice, regardless of compliance with other parts of the statute.
Okay. Okay, and the other question has to do with the business models that these companies work on, right? So there are scholars who say that actually the real problem is that the business model is the privacy violation, right? So do you agree with that, with this idea that in order to prevent this exploitation, we have to finish the data-based business models, basically?
No.
Okay.
I think there are lots of data practices that are beneficial to society. And there are some data practices that harm society a little bit, and some data practices harm society a lot. And there's not a perfect correlation between how much data they use or how profitable they are versus how exploitative they are. Contact tracing apps for college were a data use that was beneficial to society. I don't think anyone benefited from it, but if someone ran a contact tracing app with ads, I think that would have been fine. Some ads are not exploitative. I get ads all the time about sneakers that I may want to buy, or mid-century furniture because I'm gay and in my 30s. But other types of ads show tempt people with addiction problems to gamble more, or target teenage girls that are feeling insecure or vulnerable to try to sell them things to make them feel prettier when they feel insecure and vulnerable. Those things are exploitative. In the same way that data sharing can be very safe in one context when one just hires an extra server, or can be exploitative in another context when one sells data to a third party, exposing one's users to harm. That's why I think that sometimes we have discussions about algorithmic disgorgement and about whether the solution to these problems is, well, any benefit that companies derive from a certain data practice should just be given up and then we solve the problem. I don't think that fully solves the problem, because some data practices create very little benefit and a lot of harm, and other data practices create a lot of benefit and little harm. And we should have a type of regulation that encourages the ones that are safe and that discourages the ones that are not.
Hi. Yes, thank you so much. I had a question which kind of came up after you just mentioned or suggested like the provision that you said should be included.
Yeah, I'm glad, because I stopped there because I thought you were going to ask something related, but yeah.
No, because you said it should include some sort of like risk assessment, right? If you expose people to risk of harm. But how would you define that risk component? You mentioned like from a regulatory and policy perspective, it's almost impossible to anticipate the kind of future harms that may emerge from these data practices. So how would you then define the risk element, which is even more like vaguely contextual in that sense?
Yeah. I mean, we could eliminate the prediction exercise and just have a strict liability regime. That's an option. But if we don't have a strict liability regime, we do have some sort of foreseeability. I think those that are best placed to foresee what is high risk and what is low risk is not an individual that doesn't know the data practice, or a legislator trying to figure out whether a group of data practices are harmful, but rather each company making the decision every single time. When the dating app that I mentioned sold user-based data to third parties, I would say that it was foreseeable that that data could have been used to harm some users in ways that they couldn't have foreseen. When a company decides to show gambling ads to someone that they know has a gambling addiction problem, I would say that it's foreseeable that that is exploitative. Not everything is foreseeable, but I do think that there is a bit of an irony in having a system that expects people to anticipate every harm that will happen, expects legislators to anticipate every harm that could happen, and then is very light on companies that are actually making choice by choice about the extent to which they can predict harm or not. But I think you're right that some of them are not predictable. And maybe that's okay. Then there will be a policy choice about assuming that, we have low-hanging fruit, assuming that we do enact liability for those that are foreseeable. And there could be, I think, a genuinely difficult discussion about what we do when some harms are not foreseeable. I was learning about a year ago that when particles zeppelins, the ones that have like big helium balloons, and then apparently when zeppelins were invented, they exploded spontaneously and no one knew why. And regulators were a bit confused, at least according to the reporting that I read about how do we regulate these helium balloons that transport people in the air, because sometimes they explode and we don't know why, so we cannot really like set technical rules for them not to explode. And what they did was set a strict liability regime. If you make money out of having flying balloons filled with helium that also transport people, then you have to pay if you kill those people in an explosion. And that led to private sector research figure out why they explode and then not exploding anymore. So in a dynamic system, sometimes imposing liability for those things that are not unforeseeable, that are not foreseeable, can also be desirable in that sense, because then you give incentives to companies to figure out what can be harmful. The other option is playing around with the concept of foreseeability, as in not what is foreseen, but what they should have foreseen in a certain context.
Hi, thank you for this great talk. I was wondering what you think about how more stringent data protection or privacy laws, what they do for access by third parties and smaller players into the market, so the intersection of competition and data protection. So few examples come to mind. So for example, Apple's AT&T, Google's privacy sandbox, all of those were introduced as tools that would help improve consumer privacy, but we also saw that it negatively impacted a lot of third parties that needed access to this data to compete with Apple or Google. So I don't know, how do you think about this tension?
Yeah, I think partly because we have such an overexpansive view of privacy, which is individuals' control of their personal information. Privacy not only fails at protecting from many harms in the information economy, but it can also be weaponized by different actors to make claims that are not necessarily genuine as opposed to that. And I do remember reading a paper by Maria with Brian Calo that discusses that I highly recommend to you. Very vague conceptions of privacy that don't actually get into what is the harm of privacy can be used in such a way to actually rule out competition, because if privacy is control over your personal information in the world where you interact through your personal information, privacy is everything or is nothing. And that's a problem, I think. So I think a more specific notion of privacy that is tied to the reasons for which we socially care about it can help us tease out those things. But there's another problem, I think, with the regulations that you point out, which is that because they operate mostly ex ante, according to a number of antitrust theories, they also increase market concentration. There are papers, and again, I don't know the math, so I don't say that the math is correct or incorrect, but there are at least papers claiming that the GDPR increased market concentration of large tech companies because of compliance costs. And the intuition is relatively straightforward. The intuition is if you have a lot of ex-ante compliance, then large players can deal with it. Large players can hire a privacy offer. Large players can do very complicated privacy impact assessment. Large players can design useless cookie banners to populate everyone's computers to get explicit consent. But small players, not so much. So maybe they don't go into the industry. I think that's a real problem. And I think part of that problem is relieving some of the regulatory burden from ex-ante mechanisms that are not very predictive of harms, so that small players can enter more easily, and putting more of the weight exposed depending on harm. So small players that actually do not have harmful data practices have lower compliance costs at the end than large players that for whom compliance is easy, but then they can get away with harm without actually paying for it.
I want to grapple with the the kind of new ecosystem of information you're dealing with, because a lot of times companies are not dealing with the upstream data but downstream. For example, DeepSeek, the new model, is trained on previous models like Llama, which is open source, and also ChatGPT, which I'm sure have violated a lot of different laws to come to that point, right? Not just privacy, but also intellectual property and so on. So I'm thinking about nowadays that a lot of companies are dealing with the downstream data that has already caused a lot of harm, but when it's given to you, it's already a byproduct of that. How do we make sense of privacy harm in that sense?
So there are two ways to go about that. One way to go about it is saying everyone is liable only for the data practices that they do, and not liable for the data practices that other entity has done over which they are benefiting. That's, I think, one way. Another way is doing something similar to what the UAI Act does, which has a sort of products liability regime where liability can go all the way up for certain harms. Both are pros and cons. I'm probably want something in the middle. The problem of having liability that goes all the way up always is that it's impossible or it's very difficult for someone that didn't actually do that data practice to be able to audit that nothing in whatever they're getting was harmful. And similarly, when someone is doing a foundation model that then goes downstream, it's very difficult for them to be able to do a foundation model that doesn't produce harms depending on how it is used. So the extension of liability for harms downstream, I'm skeptical of, because I think that relies on the same problem of thinking that we can anticipate everything. We can't. When we're not actually the ones doing uses. Extension of liability upstream, I think it depends. I think it would depend on whether the person buying a certain product would foreseeably have seen that taking it would produce later on harms or not. I mean, there has to be a certain level of trust where we put some responsibility on the products that we're getting. But if there is a case where the model that we're buying is clearly one that would produce harm if we implement it, it would also be awkward to bracket it. I don't know if I answered your question or not really. I think
it's a difficult question.
Yeah, I think it depends, and I think the pivot should be foreseeability.
Thank you. It's nice to see you, Ignacio.
Yes, you too.
So, it seems to me that, well, I agree with you that regulations, spur innovation most times because companies have to work around it. I see the central column that you have there as the primary issue here, which is the notion of inferences, the relationality of information and the power structure. But you cannot kind of use some kind of a hammer to say, okay, this is what an inference means.
Right.
So in computer science, they have various techniques for data hiding, where they kind of get granular, okay? But granularity is used in certain applications based on the domain, granular hiding of information.
Yeah.
How do you develop policies that will kind of, or even a framework that will say, well, this is how you're going to deal with the granularity problem in these things, because you cannot just...
No, that's a good question. And I think the answer is by not obsessing anymore about what qualifies as personal information and what does not qualify as personal information. And that relates to the relational data problem. I don't think it's that important if information pertains an identifiable individual, but rather it is important whether that information can be used to exploit that individual. Yeah, so some inferences are very closely tied to individuals. The app that shared its user base to third parties had the inference of sexuality because that was not disclosed information that is very closely tied to that information. Other inferences are pretty loose and are probabilistic. Someone could be 10% more likely to do something based on a certain type of information. And that is an inference in some sense, but it's a very loose one. So when we try to have a binary strict division of this is personal information or this is not personal information, then we bump into this problem. We bump into the problem of, do we count all inference, do we count no inference, or do we count some of them but not others? And if we count no inferences, then the system is not very helpful because inferences are almost all that matters. If we count all inferences, the system that we have breaks down because you cannot have control rights over inferences. You cannot have purpose limitation over inference. That simply doesn't work. If instead we move to or we complement the current system with an ex-post accountability system, I think it stops mattering that much whether something is an inference, something is not an inference, something is anonymized or is de-identified, as long as it can be used to harm someone. I feel like you have a follow-up.
Well, no, I mean, it seems to be that it's kind of becomes domain specific then, you know? And
in what way?
Thereby, a certain financial kind of, inferences can be made for certain domains which may be necessary.
Yeah.
If, for instance, to determine creditworthiness or something like that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if somebody is coming out of bankruptcy, maybe it's not a relevant issue.
Yeah.
Or not, there may be other factors that come into the picture.
Yeah.
So then you're looking at privacy from a very domain-specific kind of perspective, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why I ambiguously call the talk how AI requires rethinking privacy. Because I think we should not think so much about control of personal information. I think we should think about how to make the information economy less exploitative without shutting it down. And I think that's partly about what is personal information about people, but it's not only about what is personal information about you. And I think you're right that some inferences are legitimate and some inferences are hugely socially beneficial, and we do want to encourage those. Mm-hmm. We don't want a system that treats all inferences, whether it's to exploit a gambler or to improve healthcare in the same way.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks for this talk. So I was wondering, you at the end was saying that we should need more regulation, rerooting innovation, and that we need more regulation, rerooting innovation, and then among these kind of tool kit, you mentioned property, IP rights, contracts. Yeah. And so many of these privacy issues come from contracts already, we live in the individual choice. I'm just curious, what kind of other type of contracts are you envisioning here?
Oh, I'm not envisioning types of contracts. I just mean that innovation and regulation are not two fungible packets of units that can be balanced. It's not like we have a sliding scale between regulation and innovation, and we can choose what is the optimal amount, and maybe the EU wants closer to regulation, and the US wants closer to innovation, and Canada, as always, wants something in the middle. I think there are different types of regulation, and there are different types of innovation, and the trade-off exists or does not exist depending on which type we're talking about.
Right.
And the proof of that is that many types of regulation facilitate to the opposite that prevent innovation. Contracts is one of them.
Right, no, I agree. In innovation law, largely scholars say that we need not only one kind of policy tool, but an array of them working together. But when we talk about contracts, usually contract theory, it's so traditional that it's completely out of the boundaries of these kind of evolving innovation. So I was just wondering, what kind of contract? Lately, I'm more thinking towards relational contracts that are more like open or incomplete contracts. I was just wondering if you have.
If I could pick a regime, I would move away from contracts.
Oh, okay.
Because I think contracts requires a meeting of the minds, and it is impossible to have a meeting of the minds in the information economy. It is impossible when we agree to a data practice to predict what are the benefits and what are the risks of that data practice. And because it is impossible to predict, it is impossible to make not only an informed decision, it's impossible to make a decision about the object of the decision. Mm-hmm. Therefore, consent doesn't exist in the information economy, only agreements exist. That is different in other interactions. In many one-to-one interactions where we do have a disclosed piece of information, then we could make a risk assessment about that piece of information and we could agree or not agree. When the ISP asked me if this could be recorded, I said yes. I think I have a relatively complete notion about what recording means. It is not equivalent to a case where a credit rating agency collects boundless information about me, aggregates it with other information they buy from data brokers, and then makes inference about me. I think over the first, I can make an actual decision. Over the second one, I can't. And over all the contexts in which we cannot make actual decisions, then we do need to move away from contracts models. Because then what we end up having is consent, not as a way for people to self-protect, but as responsibility shifting. Cookie banners don't serve the purpose, mostly, of people actually knowing what's happening with their personal information because they don't know the data practice downstream. It mostly happens so companies can exempt themselves from responsibility for whatever happens after. I think we should do away with that. Yeah.
I keep listening that you come back to this idea of the subject's interests, right? Like, okay, not every exploitation is bad, only the one that goes against the interest of people. Like, I would like them to show me ads that would be beneficial for me.
I think sometimes you can be exploited in accordance to your interests.
Okay, so yeah, what I mean is, I think that you think that those type of exploitations are fine and we can deal with them, right?
I think no type of exploitation is fine, but maybe we have different definitions of exploitation.
Okay, yeah, maybe. Use of my data for purposes that benefit myself. That would be okay.
It may or may not be, depending on the type. I think there could be uses of data well, I don't think there's such a thing as your data. I think there are uses of data that benefit you, or there are uses of data that benefit other people that are not you, and those are in general legitimate. I think if you go to Yale Health and you get an examination, and then the doctor, let's imagine that we don't have HIPAA, and then the doctor anonymizes thoroughly your medical data, and then puts in a database that then is used for healthcare research to improve the health of, to make a marginal improvement to the health of millions of people around the world. I think that's a good use of data.
Okay, good. So yeah, I was wrong. You were talking about these more general values that might affect more people than myself, right? But my question is, isn't that still subjective? Like, let's think about John F. Kennedy Jr., right? If you use these data to develop a new vaccine, we would say that's great, but he thinks that vaccines are not great.
Right.
So who can determine whether those exploitations of data are good or not?
Yeah, that's the toughest question. And I think that is a challenge, I mean, that is not unique to the information economy or privacy law, but that is a challenge whenever we get into social values. Like, who determines what is speech? Who determines what is democracy? Who determines what is every social value that we have, either the Constitution or another? Who determines what is foreseeable? Who determines what is reasonable is a key question. So whenever we move from specific rules to principles that can be interpreted in different ways, we do have a power shifting mechanism. And that can be good or bad depending on how much trust you put in every single agent of the system. I think we have very good reasons to be skeptical of how judges would interpret all these sorts of things, particularly based on a history of the Supreme Court that narrows down standing and that narrows down privacy harm. I still think, even in the current context of the United States, there will be a marginal improvement over the alternative, which is not having it at all. And I think in other places or in other contexts where we can put more trust into those agents, and that's even a bigger improvement. But I think you're right that making rules more ambiguous does involve power shifting, and we should be aware, if not wary, of how that operates. But yeah, I think in some sense, that is a harder question for other industries than for this one. I think in other industries where specific rules can actually be helpful at predicting harm, then there are tougher questions about whether you trust the legislators to formulate them or you just trust the judges to apply principles and who you may trust more? Or do you think that there's regulatory capture and you trust the regulators or not to implement certain things if you have public enforcement, or the judges if you have private enforcement? But in contexts where the predictiveness is very low, then even if you do trust legislators more than judges, then that's a parallel challenge, I think, to the implementation of the specific ones.
I have a question. So we kind of touched on this with the vaccine example about the idea that your or one person's personal data can be used to exploit and to benefit the person whose data it is, but also clearly could be used for various knowledge creation purposes to benefit others. And I guess this also connects to the compass thing where it seems like this is a case where if you are successful in implementing some kind of crime prevention and or like crime attribution mechanism, your one person's data is kind of benefiting others. I wonder whether you've given more thought to or have like some concrete take on the treatment of personal data when there's a clear and significant benefit to others.
Yeah, that's great. So I think part of what the concept of exploitation needs to do is to prevent one person being instrumentalized with the benefits of others. So to prevent one person being harmed for the greater good that is the benefit of others. Because that would be, even if the benefit is not internalized by the person making the data process, even if the benefit is externalized, if that person is worse off, then that could be exploitative. But the application on different cases could be more complicated and it could depend depending on the cases. In the case of Compass, for example, I mean, you raise a really important point in that the idea that courts try to predict whether someone will commit a crime during the period in which they would be released for bail or parole is pre-AI. And it's an open question about whether courts should actually use that as a discerning factor to determine who gets bail or who gets parole or should not. But even assuming that is a discerning factor for who gets bail or who gets parole, if it is the case that a software improves the predictiveness over the predictiveness that judges would otherwise have and is less biased than judges would otherwise be, then that could be a good use, a socially good use of personal information. It happens that that is not the use that happens with Compass and other softwares. Compass and other risk assessment algorithms are trained on arrest data, and arrest data is racially biased. So they replicate the racial bias in arrest data, at least according to reporting, and there's some research showing that not only they replicate the bias in arrest data, but they amplify the bias in arrest data. So the software ends up being more biased than just running a regression.
Right. Yeah, I think Compass is a pretty straw man example. I guess one trope that's been at least playing through my mind a lot recently is the fact that I think we have much more data to tell when somebody is failing to stop at a stop sign now than like we did many years ago.
Yeah.
And I suppose this came up actually in a conversation about a different thing, a conversation about the fact that laws are designed with imperfect enforcement in mind.
Oh, yeah.
And if we actually prosecuted fully everyone who rolls through a stop sign, we could be living quite draconianly. I guess in the case of somebody who fails to stop at the stop sign and they're like clearly irresponsible, in that case it seems like there's great benefit, I suppose, to others.
I think that would be a great example of when it would be good to use personal data without actually requiring individual consent for the processing of that personal data. And stop signs and speeding cameras are a great example because, some of them are designed with imperfect enforcement in mind and some others are not. When the police puts a camera somewhere in the middle of the road somewhere, then they're using that as a proxy for average speed. So they probably want to have imperfect enforcement of that, not perfect enforcement. When they put a camera just where the school is, then they actually want to just lower the speed at that school. So that's why they disclose where some cameras are and not others. But it is true that systems are designed with imperfect enforcement in mind. I think we also need to think about when imperfect enforcement that is random or that is biased is exactly what we want, and imperfect enforcement is a bad thing, and we can kind of rely on the noise or on the bias to compensate for how draconian it would be to have perfect enforcement. And when actually the noise or the bias were compensating imperfectly for how draconian the imperfect enforcement is, and then you do want perfect enforcement with a slightly different rule. Like if it is the case that for speeding or for stop signs, you catch some people and not others, and that's a good thing because you don't want to catch everyone, but you always catch the same type of people, then maybe what you want is fewer stop signs for different speeding limits and then catching everyone.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. It was a
Well,
pleasure to listen.
Thank you for having me. I'll speak